hello! So, spring has finally arrived. Wait a minute. That's better. It feels like this week spring has finally arrived. So the heat pump, we installed it in August last year and it is now towards the end of April. So it's been in for approximately 9 months. And that's been the bulk really of the heating season. Let's have a little recap. A little bit about this house. So it's an end terrace house. It's got solid walls for about 80% of the house, and it's got a small little bit on the back that has cavity walls, non-insulated, with a flat roof. And it's approximately 200 years old, so it's definitely not like a modern house. So the total floor area of the house is 70 meters squared. I made an error in the last video where I just quoted the ground floor area. Also documented in the previous video was my heat loss calculation, which came out with a figure of around 3.3 kilowatts. So based on this, I fitted a 5 kilowatt heat pump. This was actually one of the smallest heat pumps available. So that's approximately 30% oversized, and this hasn't been a problem at all, and possibly being 20 to 30% oversized is quite a good place to be, really. But the important thing is to make sure the heat loss calculation was right. A lot of heat loss calculations overestimate the amount of heat. This is the reason why you may want to be maybe 20% oversized, is because at colder temperatures, even a 5 kilowatt heat pump, you don't get the rated output of 5 kilowatts in the colder temperatures, especially if you're running at a higher flow temperature. Just out of interest, let's have a look at the EPC for my property. As you can see, it's pretty abysmal. It was done quite a few years ago, back in 2015, and since then I have topped up the loft insulation and fitted better windows, but largely the house is pretty much unchanged. But I do believe this EPC is not totally accurate. So this screenshot at the top was taken from the EPC, which shows that the house, based on the EPC, should need 14,000 kilowatt hours per year. My heat loss calculation came out that the house should need around 7,500 kilowatt hours per year. So the actual heat demand that I actually put in this winter was just over 6,000 kilowatt hours per year. That is only for 9 months, but the heating season has now finished, so I'm not expecting that to change. The heat demand on the EPC is double what the actual heat demand is. So the takeaway from this is that EPCs are not particularly accurate, and definitely don't use an EPC to size a heat pump. If I'd used this EPC data here, I might well have come to the conclusion that I needed to fit an 8 or even a 10 kilowatt heat pump, which would be way oversized for this property. One of the main reasons why my heat loss calculation was so accurate is that I did a door blower test, which showed that my house was more airtight than like the default value that's often used in models. So yeah, I highly recommend, if you're interested in energy efficiency, to get a door blower test done on your house. This winter has actually been the coldest winter we've had for many years. So it's been a really good test for the heat pump. We had several nights that were like down below -3. One night went down to -5. And we also had quite long periods, like multiple days, where the temperature didn't really go above 0. So it's a really good test for the heat pump. And I'm happy to report that the heat pump kept the house lovely and warm, even through the coldest of periods. I'm not the only one who lives in this house, so let's hear from Harry and Amy to see what you think of the heat pump. Have you enjoyed having a nice warm bedroom, Harry?
The house is definitely warmer. Before, we worked on the principle of heating our main living area, mainly by the wood stove, and as soon as you left this room, it would be drastically colder in all other areas of the house, which got used to, was fine, but it has been rather pleasant to have a house which is warm everywhere. It's felt quite luxurious, really.
So this is what the indoor part of the heat pump looks like, with a hot water tank. There's a bit of a squeeze to get everything in here, as you saw from my installation video. But yeah, everything's been working well, there's been no changes. So this heat pump is fitted with a full level 3 open energy monitor monitoring system. So that consists of a heat meter here. Inside here it monitors the flow of the liquid going through. Then there's a temperature sensor pocket that you can just see over there. That monitors the flow temperature of the liquid. So then by knowing the return temperature, the flow temperature and the speed of the liquid, the heat meter can then calculate the heat being delivered. We've also got a couple of electricity meters there. These are STM120 Modbus electricity meters. One of them is monitoring the outdoor unit energy and one of them is monitoring the indoor unit energy, which is the pumps and the control system. And I add both of them together and include the power used by both of them in the monitoring. So over the past 9 months that I've had the heat pump installed, it's averaged an overall SCOP, a seasonal coefficient of performance, of 4.26. So this is fantastic. I'm very happy with this performance. It is actually one of the best performing heat pumps upon heatpumpmonitor.org, which is a website that compares data from lots of different heat pumps from all over the UK, where you can see the live output and compare the performance. Just a graph of how the COP varies month on month. As you can see, it did drop during that cold period in December, but it's still got a COP of almost 3.9, which is still very good. At the start of this year, I started recording heating energy and domestic hot water energy separately. So here you can see the difference between hot water and heating COP month on month. So this is the split of how much hot water we used compared with heating. And even though we do use quite a bit of hot water, we have 1 to 2 showers per day, and we've got a baby that has a bath every night. And we also do the washing up using hot water. The hot water demand was less than 12% of our overall heat demand. This is the heat pump controller, which is located downstairs here in the living room. So we use this as the thermostat for the heat pump. We don't use any third-party controls. So this is our normal daytime set point of 19 degrees, and then it goes up to 20.5 in the evenings. So I run the heat pump on a schedule. So I have a setback temperature at night, and I'll also only heat the hot water at certain times of day. The water out temperature here that I've chosen, it's pretty much a flat flow temperature. This is not how people normally run a heat pump. Usually you'd have a much greater variation between these two numbers. If, for example, when it's much colder outside, you need a higher flow temperature. But because I've got such large radiators here, I've found that a 34 degree flow temperature is adequate to heat the house even down to -3 degrees outside. And you're probably asking, why don't I reduce the flow temperature lower than 33 degrees? You know, at like this time of year when it's much warmer outside. What I found is that this Samsung heat pump doesn't seem to like running below about 33, 34 degrees. If I go much below that, if I go down to as low as 30, the output gets quite unstable, and actually the overall performance is actually lower. I've got the Samsung Wi-Fi gateway. This allows the heat pump to be controlled remotely via the Samsung SmartThings app. It's quite a basic app, but it allows the basic functions to be adjusted, like the set point of the temperature, and you can see the temperature in the living room, turn on and off away mode, so it's very useful when you're coming back from a holiday. So we're now on day 3 of what's been the coldest few days of the year so far. It was nearly -3 outside here last night. It's about -1 now, and the heat pump's been working really well. It's been running pretty much 24 hours a day. And you can see that's the condenser icing up a bit, and then it runs a defrost cycle to clear the ice. Actually, the noise you can hear here is the heat pump, but also my neighbour's oil boiler, which is pretty much as loud. So as you can hear me speaking fine. So it's not particularly loud really. It's just a little bit of air movement up there. Most people don't really notice it. This is inside the kitchen. The heat pump is located just above the window sill there, and it's totally inaudible when you're inside. Vibration mounts I fitted are obviously doing their job, because no vibrations or anything are being transferred inside the house. So let's have a look at the running costs compared with other heating fuels. So assuming if I was on a flat rate tariff paying 34p per kilowatt hour, which is currently the price cap, the heat pump would have cost me £613 to run over this 9-month period over winter. So that's 30% cheaper than mains gas, but mains gas isn't available in my area here. I was previously running, my combi boiler was on bottled propane, so the heat pump is now half the cost of bottled propane. Now let's compare the carbon intensity of these different heating fuels. You can see the heat pump is by far the lowest carbon option. It's almost 6 times lower carbon than mains gas. It's interesting that direct electric heating, even though it is insanely expensive, it's actually lower carbon than mains gas, and that's because the electricity grid is now getting pretty clean. The percentage of electricity generated from renewables is increasing every year. So as I alluded to earlier, I didn't actually pay a flat rate tariff to run my heat pump. I've actually got a home battery storage system, and I'm currently on an off-peak tariff, so I pay a cheaper amount overnight. So this battery is a 9.5 kilowatt hour Give Energy AC coupled system. And just to give you an idea here, you can see that in yellow is the energy used by the heat pump. That red line there is energy that the battery can store. So you can see most of the year, my heat pump uses less energy than the battery can hold. So that means that the battery could basically run the heat pump for the whole day. But I did some analysis on this to see, how much of the heat pump energy did the battery actually cover. And on average, it's about 56% of peak time usage was covered by the battery. Obviously, this was less during the colder months of the year, when the heat pump used more energy. So now if I calculate the cost of the heat pump, running the heat pump, using the battery, this reduced the cost of the running costs even further. So this is the minimum SCOP, the minimum coefficient of performance to achieve cost parity. So if your heat pump, this is all based on today's prices, so it may vary by the time this video is released. If your heat pump is getting a SCOP of around 2.96, then it's the same price as mains gas. But because bottled propane and LPG are more expensive than mains gas, this lower threshold drops. So if you're on LPG or propane, you only need to get a SCOP of either 2.4 or 2.1, or if you're on direct electric, you'll need to get a SCOP of 1 to be cheaper. So that's quite a low bar. I mean, even the worst performing heat pumps will easily get a SCOP of like 2.5. Most heat pumps is easily doable to get a SCOP of 3 and above. Due to space constraints, I've got a relatively small 150 litre hot water tank. The hot water gets topped up twice per day to between 40 to 45 degrees. It's more efficient to heat the tank up when the water inside is relatively cool. This is why I schedule 2 top-ups per day rather than lots of little top-ups. I don't use the immersion. The hot water is heated just by the heat pump because our tank is quite small and it gets flushed on almost a daily basis. I'm not particularly concerned about Legionella. After we've been away for any period of time and the hot water's been sitting in the tank, I run a manual Legionella protection cycle by heating the tank up to 55 degrees, and I can do this just using the heat pump, no immersion heater required. Since getting a home battery installed, I've stopped using the My Energy Eddy solar PV diverter, and I now just use the heat pump to heat hot water all through the summer. This is because it's more efficient to store the solar PV energy in the battery and then run a hot water cycle using the heat pump. So what made the system perform so well? I mean, basically I think is that I just kept it simple. So I've just got an open loop system, no low loss headers or buffers or zones or anything. It's just a open loop system and radiators. So that's radiator number 1 in the living room. This is radiator number 2 in the living room. And here we have radiator number 3 in the living room. We have the kick space heater under the kitchen cabinets here in the kitchen. Got a radiator in the hallway, radiator in the corridor upstairs, spare room radiator, And finally, here's the radiator in our bedroom. I do have TRVs on the radiators, but I've kept them all open. Probably the most important thing with making a system work efficiently is to have a low flow temperature. My system ran at between 30 to 35 degree flow temperature throughout the whole year. Also, my system has got really good airflow, being wall mounted around the unit. If the heat pump was installed in a small yard with like walls all around it, then there may be an issue with like a cold well where the unit can't get enough warm air through it. Let's dive straight in here. This is the coldest 24 hours on the 13th of December, and the temperature dropped down to -5 degrees overnight. And for this entire 24-hour period, the average temperature was -2 degrees C. And I was pretty pleased that even with these really cold temperatures, the heat pump was able to maintain heat in the house no problem. And it was also able to do this with a low flow temperature of 35 degrees, just using radiators. And it managed to get a COP of 3.2, even on the coldest day of the year, when temperature went down to -5, the heat pump was still cheaper to run than mains gas would have been. You may recall in my heat loss calculation, I calculated that my property should need 3.3 kilowatts of heat when it's -3 outside. During this period, the average temperature outside was -2 degrees, and the average heat requirement was 3 kilowatts. I'm pretty pleased with this. This indicates that my heat loss calculation was pretty much spot on. So this is a fairly typical winter day. This was the 28th of November. The average temperature over this period was 7.5 degrees. This is fairly typical for North Wales winter day. Got a COP of 4.5 today. Again, these figures include 2 hot water cycles. Now, it may look like the heat pump cycling here. Depends what the definition of cycling is. I would just say it's going on and off. I'd define cycling as like very rapid on and offs, where this is more, there's hours in between these cycles. This is the power of having a monitoring system like the Open Energy Monitor system that lets us really dive down into the data and have a look in detail. So I've got here side by side the day on the left here is the day I just showed you, where the heat pump was running at 35 degrees and cycling on and off. And I chose another day which had like pretty much the identical outdoor temperature. But the main difference between these two is on the right is when I was experimenting running at a much lower flow temperature of 30 degrees. And you can see the heat pump, the run times were much longer, which you'd usually think longer run times equals better performance, but that's not always the case. It must be that the heat pump is just more tuned to work at like 35 degrees and above, and once I start going below that, it's a bit like trying to drive at 20 miles an hour in fifth gear, trying to get better fuel economy, where it becomes a point where actually the reverse happens. So you can see that running at a higher flow temperature actually got a higher COP of 4.5 here, where this lower flow temperature got a COP of 4. This is probably very specific to my heat pump, and there could well be other heat pumps that'll go down to lower flow temperatures without an issue. But I think there is a lower limit to how low you should set your flow temperature or your weather comp curve, and I would recommend not going, certainly not going below 30 degrees, and maybe even considering not going below 35 degrees. Up until now, all the figures and data I've talked about has been obtained from my independent Open Energy monitoring system. But Samsung does have an inbuilt monitoring system, which the data is displayed on the controller display, and I'm also reading that same data via Modbus. Doing some analysis, I've come to the conclusion that basically the Samsung system, inbuilt monitoring system, underreports heat by 20%, and it over-reports electricity by 5%. And the result of this is that the SCOP is 30% lower. And the main error seems to come from the temperature reading on the Samsung system. The temperature sensors that are located outside, the little strap-on sensors on the pipework, and they don't seem to be particularly good at reading the flow and return temperature. It's around 1 degree lower than the Sontex meter, which uses temperature sensor pockets to more accurately measure the temperature of the liquid. The Sontex heat meter is it's a billing grade class 2 mid-approved heat meter, so it's 2% accurate. So I'm more inclined to believe the certified heat meter rather than the Samsung inbuilt monitoring, which doesn't have any guarantees of accuracy, and it's mostly there to inform the onboard control system. Congratulations if you've made it this far. I do realise this video has been quite data heavy, but I think it's the best way to share my experience and demonstrate that a heat pump installed correctly can work really well in an older property like this. Thank you for watching.